The world had already ended. It wasn't a grand, explosive conclusion like most movies had portrayed, but a slow, agonizing collapse. People had stopped noticing the little things, the days that felt wrong, the sudden tension in the air, the unspoken dread that hovered like a thick cloud. Then, one day, it was all too late. The streets became flooded with screams and chaos as the first wave of zombies, the infected, emerged from the shadows, moving with a horrifying relentlessness. For Lucas Carter, it was the day he lost everything. He sat in a small, abandoned apartment, the window cracked just enough to let in the faintest light of the dying sun. His fingers trembled slightly as he traced the strap of the worn backpack on the floor in front of him. It was a simple thing, nothing special in the grand scheme of survival. But it was his bag, and it contained everything he would need to survive this apocalypse. "Don't overthink it, Lucas," he muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. His mind had already spun in 100 different directions, trying to make sense of the world outside. The bag held food, water, first aid supplies, a flashlight, a few tools for crafting makeshift weapons, everything he had managed to gather in the few frantic days since the outbreak began. But more than that, it was a symbol. It was his lifeline, the only thing that stood between him and certain death. With the world outside crawling with the undead, the safety of this apartment felt like a fleeting luxury. The walls were cracked, the air stifling, and the silence that had once been calming was now suffocating. Lucas had no idea how long he could hold out here, alone. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard a human voice, not counting the screams of the people who had been caught in the initial chaos. The sound of shuffling feet outside brought him back to reality. He quickly stood up, his heartbeat quickening. With his eyes trained on the door, he grabbed his bag, slinging it over his shoulder with practiced ease. He was used to this, moving silently, staying hidden, always a step ahead of the threat. The bag had become an extension of himself, a constant companion in this nightmare. Outside, the zombies were everywhere. The creatures that had once been human were now little more than mindless predators, driven only by an insatiable hunger for flesh. But they didn't just wander aimlessly. They were drawn to sounds, to movement, and to the smell of fresh meat. Lucas had learned the hard way that the slightest mistake could lead to a fatal encounter. He had learned to move quietly, to keep a low profile, and above all, to avoid human contact. It was a lesson that had cost him dearly when he had tried to trust others in the beginning. The first group he had found had been kind, at first. They had shared their food, offered him a bed, and for a brief moment, Lucas had believed that maybe, just maybe, there was hope. But that hope was short-lived. The betrayal came one cold night, just as the group had been preparing to leave for a safer place. The leader, a man named Derek, had claimed there wasn't enough food to go around and that they'd have to make hard choices. Lucas had protested, but in the end, he had been left behind. The others had taken what little supplies they could, leaving him to fend for himself. The trust that had once bound them together had evaporated into thin air, and Lucas had learned the hardest lesson of all: survival was a solitary endeavor. The sound of the zombies outside brought him back to the present. Lucas couldn't afford to linger in one place for too long. He had to keep moving, keep pushing forward. The bag was his only connection to any hope, the only thing keeping him tethered to the notion of survival. Without it, he was nothing. He moved to the window, peering through the gap. In the distance, the streets were littered with the remains of a world that no longer existed. Buildings that had once been symbols of human achievement now stood in ruin, abandoned and decaying. The sky, once blue and clear, was now a sickly gray, as if even the heavens themselves had given up on this place. Lucas knew he couldn't stay here forever. The apartment was too exposed, too predictable. The undead had already begun to roam the area, and it was only a matter of time before they found him. He needed to leave. He needed to get to the one place he thought might still offer a sliver of hope, the old military outpost on the outskirts of town. There was a rumor, of course. A rumor that the outpost was still operational, that there were survivors holed up there, that it was a haven. But in this new world, rumors were a dangerous thing to cling to. Still, it was better than nothing. And so, with the weight of his bag on his back, Lucas made his decision. He was going to take that chance. As he moved toward the door, he glanced one last time at the apartment, the place that had been his shelter, his prison, his home in this broken world. He wasn't sure when, or if, he'd ever return. But for now, he had a single chance. One bag, one shot at survival. And that was enough. End of part 1. The door creaked as Lucas slowly pushed it open, the sound sending a wave of tension through his body. It was a noise too loud, too brash for a world that demanded silence. His pulse raced as he glanced down the hallway, half expecting to see the hollow eyes of the undead staring back at him. But the coast was clear, for now. Taking a deep breath, Lucas stepped out into the narrow corridor of the building. His every step felt heavy, weighted with the knowledge that survival was no longer about the next meal, it was about staying alive just one more minute. The world outside was different now, twisted by the horrors of the infection. It no longer felt like a place where people lived, it felt like a graveyard where the living had no choice but to bury themselves. He moved swiftly, the backpack pressing into his shoulders as he adjusted its strap. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Inside, his world had been reduced to the bare essentials: water, food, medicine, a few weapons, tools that could extend his life, if he was lucky. But luck had never been on his side, and as he moved toward the stairs, he knew that getting to the outpost wasn't going to be easy. It was at least a 3-hour walk, maybe more, through what was once a bustling city, now abandoned and overrun by the undead. The elevator had long since stopped working, so the stairs were his only option. He descended carefully, mindful of each creak in the floorboards. Every sound, no matter how small, could betray him. The last thing he wanted was to encounter the infected in such close quarters. Halfway down, Lucas froze. A sound. Not from above, not from below, but from the alleyway just outside the building. He strained his ears, holding his breath. Footsteps. Soft, uneven. A shuffle that didn't belong to a human. He cursed under his breath. It was a zombie. It wasn't far. He could hear it dragging its feet, wandering aimlessly, getting closer with every second. He had to act fast. His instincts kicked in. Quietly, he dropped to a crouch and moved toward the nearest window, careful not to make a sound. Peering out, he saw the creature, its body twisted and contorted, its skin a sickly gray. The air seemed to hum with a sense of death as it continued its mindless shuffle down the street. It was close enough that Lucas could see the faint tracks of blood on the pavement, evidence of a once living human. His grip tightened around the handle of the crowbar he had grabbed earlier. It wasn't ideal, but it was something to defend himself with if needed. He watched the zombie for a moment, waiting for it to pass. The more time he spent in the open, the more vulnerable he became. But the longer he stayed hidden, the better his chances. It was a standoff. Seconds turned into minutes as Lucas calculated his next move. There was no way to avoid it, the alleyway would lead him straight to the street where the zombies roamed. He would have to be swift, silent. Finally, the zombie turned down a side alley, disappearing into the gloom. Lucas exhaled slowly. His pulse was still racing, but at least for now, he had avoided the encounter. He moved quickly, using the shadows to his advantage. The streets were a deadly maze, and every corner was a potential trap. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stepped outside, feeling the cold air bite at his skin. The city around him felt like a ghost town, empty, hollow. Windows were shattered, doors were ajar, and the smell of decay lingered in the air. The apocalypse had erased everything, leaving only the remnants of a once vibrant civilization. The streets were filled with danger. The undead had taken over, but it wasn't just the zombies that Lucas feared. It was the desperate, hungry people who still roamed the city. Humans were just as dangerous, if not more so. He had learned that the hard way when Derek and his group had betrayed him. There was no one left to trust. As Lucas walked cautiously down the street, the weight of his decisions settled on him. He had no allies now, no backup. His backpack was his only companion, and it was everything he had left. If the rumors about the military outpost were true, it was his best shot at survival. But that best shot was a long shot. The sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement.
He knew he didn't have much time before darkness fell.
Night was when the creatures became more aggressive, more restless. And the cold, starless sky was a perfect backdrop for the things that lurked in the darkness, human and undead alike. Lucas quickened his pace, determined to make it through the night. His eyes flickered to every shadow, every noise. His senses were on edge. The street was eerily quiet, but he knew better than to trust silence.
Silence meant waiting.
And waiting meant that something, somewhere, was preparing to strike. With each step, he pushed aside his fear. The only thing that mattered now was reaching the outpost. If he could just make it there. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, a loud crash, followed by the unmistakable growl of a zombie.
He wasn't alone. End of Part 2.
The growl echoed down the street, sharp and guttural, sending a chill down Lucas's spine. His breath caught in his throat. For a moment, his world seemed to narrow, the chaotic city around him fading into a blur as his senses honed in on the sound. The footsteps were getting closer, heavy, dragging, the unmistakable shuffle of the undead. Lucas moved instinctively, ducking behind a crumbled pillar that had once been part of a grand storefront. He pressed his back against the cold stone, holding his breath as he tried to steady his racing heart. The air around him felt thick with dread, as though the very atmosphere was suffused with the rot of the world's demise. Peering around the corner, he saw it. A lone zombie, a woman from the look of her tattered clothes, stumbling down the street, dragging one foot behind her. Her face was a grotesque mask of decay, the skin pulled tight over the bones, her mouth slightly open in a slack expression. But it was her eyes that locked onto Lucas's gaze.
Vacant. Hollow.
They were the eyes of a thing that had once been human but was now lost forever to the madness of the infection.
Lucas froze, every muscle in his body tensing.
If it caught his scent, he would have mere seconds before it would rush toward him. He had no choice but to wait. The zombie's growl grew louder, and it slowly staggered closer, seemingly oblivious to Lucas's presence.
He took a steadying breath.
His eyes darted to the bag on his back.
It was the only thing that mattered right now, his survival depended on it.
But as the zombie grew closer, he realized there was something else in the street, something darker. His mind was already running through scenarios, trying to piece together what had gone wrong, what mistakes he had made.
He needed to stay calm.
The creature was no more than a few feet away now, and Lucas couldn't risk the chance that it might hear him move. He needed a distraction, something to draw the zombie away, something to buy him just a little more time. His eyes scanned the street in desperation. That's when he saw it, the overturned cart of canned goods just a few paces away, one of the remnants of the city's long-forgotten market. The street was littered with debris, and in the shadows, he could make out the faint shape of a rusty metal pipe. Without thinking, Lucas grabbed the pipe, holding it tightly in his hands. His fingers curled around the cold, sharp edge as he silently moved to position himself behind the cart. He wasn't a fighter by nature, he had always preferred to stay out of the fray, to avoid confrontation. But this world had taught him otherwise. Survival was the name of the game now, and the rules had changed. The zombie was closer now, only an arm's length away, dragging its rotting form past Lucas's hiding spot. He could smell it, the sour stench of decay mixed with the sickly sweet odor of blood. It made his stomach turn, but he forced himself to ignore it. He was a survivor. That's what mattered. Lucas took a deep breath and, with a sudden motion, hurled the metal pipe down the street, sending it clanging across the pavement. The noise was deafening, echoing off the abandoned buildings, but it had the desired effect. The zombie's attention snapped to the sound, its head jerking in the direction of the distraction. The creature groaned and lurched toward the noise, its body moving like a broken machine. It was slow. Too slow. Lucas felt a surge of relief flood through him as the creature moved farther away. But the danger wasn't over yet. He couldn't linger here for too long. Carefully, Lucas crept out from his hiding spot, his eyes locked on the zombie's back. He moved quickly, staying low, his every step calculated. He had to keep moving forward, keep pushing toward the outpost. The longer he stayed in this dead city, the more likely he would run into others, humans or zombies, and the risks would only increase. He moved around the corner, keeping an eye on the zombie as it shuffled further into the distance, distracted by the pipe. His heart was still pounding in his chest, but he had no time to waste. The night was falling fast, and he needed to reach the outskirts before the shadows became too deep. He couldn't afford to be caught out here after dark.
As Lucas continued down the street, he couldn't help but think about the bag on his back.
It was the only thing keeping him grounded, the only constant in a world that was now completely alien to him. Everything he had left, the food, the water, the makeshift weapons, was inside it. It was his lifeline. His one chance. But it was also a weight he had to carry, both physically and emotionally. Every time he stopped to rest, every time he paused to catch his breath, the bag was there, reminding him of the fragile thread of hope that still hung over him. He didn't know if he would make it to the outpost, or if it even existed. But the thought of stopping, of giving up, was too terrifying to contemplate. The world had become a place where everything was uncertain. The only thing that was clear was that survival came with a cost.
And Lucas was willing to pay it. End of Part 3.
The streets grew quieter as the night fell, and the city, once teeming with life, now felt like a hollow shell, full of empty echoes and the occasional groan of the undead. Lucas could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on him, each shadow cast by the fading light of day seeming darker than the last. The distant howl of the wind and the scrape of debris tumbling down the street were the only sounds he could hear as he moved quickly, staying as close to the edges of the buildings as possible. His heart pounded in his chest, each footstep heavy with the knowledge that danger could be lurking just around every corner. Lucas had traveled miles already, the streets becoming more treacherous as he neared the outskirts of town. The once bustling marketplace was now nothing more than an abandoned collection of rusted carts, overturned kiosks, and empty stalls. Shattered windows and cracked facades lined the streets like the empty eyes of a forgotten world. His eyes flickered to every movement in the shadows, but it was always just a trick of the light or a gust of wind rattling the broken remains of a sign. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The sound of shuffling feet reached his ears, faint but unmistakable. His instincts flared, and he pressed his back against the nearest wall, straining his ears to listen. The shuffling grew louder, and soon, he could make out the distinctive groaning of the undead. His heart skipped a beat, he wasn't alone. And from the sound of it, there was more than one of them. His mind raced. Should he hide? Should he fight? He didn't have the luxury of making mistakes. He peered cautiously around the corner. Two figures, dragging their feet in an eerily synchronized rhythm, moved through the alley ahead. Both were in tatters, one man, one woman. Their eyes were vacant, their movements sluggish but relentless, each step a mindless pursuit of whatever living creature was near. The woman's body was grotesquely bloated, her skin hanging loose in places, but the man, his face was a mess of half-rotted flesh, only a few tattered remnants of his former clothes left on him. Lucas's breath caught in his throat as he held his position, hoping they hadn't noticed him. His pulse raced, and every muscle in his body screamed for him to move, to act, but there was nothing he could do but wait. He had learned long ago that the zombies weren't particularly fast or agile, but in numbers, they were dangerous. And these two weren't alone, he could hear the shuffle of more approaching from deeper within the alley. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the very atmosphere had grown heavy with the threat of death. Without taking his eyes off the approaching zombies, Lucas slowly pulled the crowbar from his bag and gripped it tightly. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Every step he took was careful, calculated. He couldn't afford to slip up. The first zombie, the man, came into view fully, his face a grotesque mask of twisted hunger. Lucas could almost feel its eyes boring into him, though they were too dead to truly see him. The stench of decay filled the air, making his stomach churn. He had to make a move now, or they would close in on him, and he'd be overwhelmed. With his heart hammering in his chest, Lucas waited for the right moment. The moment the zombie's back was turned, he slipped out from his hiding spot, moving with surprising speed. He swung the crowbar at the back of the man's head. Crack! The sound of the blow was loud enough to make him wince. The zombie staggered, its head snapping to one side, but it didn't fall. It groaned, slowly turning toward Lucas with its dead, lifeless eyes. Lucas didn't hesitate. He swung again, this time with all his strength, the crowbar crashing into the zombie's skull. The creature crumpled, its body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. But before he could catch his breath, the woman zombie turned, her grotesque face twisting as she let out an agonized moan. She lurched toward him with a sudden burst of movement. "Damn it!" Lucas hissed under his breath. He had no time to waste. He darted backward, grabbing the bag from his shoulder and pulling it tighter. His only thought now was to get away, to survive. The woman zombie was fast, but Lucas was faster. He ducked under her reaching arms and slammed the crowbar into the side of her head, sending her stumbling backward. She was relentless, but Lucas knew this was his chance. He ran. The alleyway was narrow, the buildings towering on either side, but Lucas's legs moved like pistons, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. He didn't stop to look back. He couldn't. He had to keep moving. The sound of the zombie's growls faded as Lucas pushed forward, weaving through the alley, his steps sure and determined. The further he got, the more the sounds of the city seemed to fade. The crowd of undead was thickening, but there was a moment of respite here in the winding streets, where he could breathe just a little easier. His eyes stayed on the horizon, on the distant lights of the outskirts of the city, where the military outpost was supposed to be. He had made it this far. He couldn't stop now. But his mind kept drifting to the weight of the bag on his back, the only thing he could rely on. The one thing keeping him tethered to the fragile hope of survival. What would he find there? Was there really safety beyond the chaos? End of Part 4. The city's edge was closer than Lucas had anticipated, the faint outline of the military outpost coming into view as he emerged from the alleyway and into an open street. The once bustling avenues were now eerily silent, save for the occasional groan or shuffle of a lone zombie stumbling aimlessly in the distance. The horizon was darkening, the sun dipping lower, casting long, jagged shadows across the broken world. Lucas's legs ached with exhaustion, and his chest burned with each labored breath, but he pushed on. The bag on his back felt heavier with every step, the weight of his survival pressing down on him like a constant reminder of how fragile his situation was. He couldn't afford to stop. Not now. As he moved closer to the outskirts, his mind raced. The outpost should have been a sanctuary, a place where he could find food, water, and safety from the relentless nightmare outside the city. But what if it wasn't? What if the outpost had fallen, just like everything else? What if there was no hope left? He shook the thoughts from his mind, willing himself to focus on the task at hand. One step at a time. Just keep moving. The first sign of the outpost came in the form of a tall, rusted chain-link fence that surrounded the perimeter. A warning sign, now torn and faded, hung on the gate, but its message was lost to time and neglect. There were no guards, no patrols, just the remnants of a once secure compound, now exposed to the elements. The gate was slightly ajar, the hinges creaking in the wind as if inviting him inside. Lucas approached cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of life or the lack of it. The silence was oppressive, and the weight in his chest grew heavier with each passing second. He was close, but he wasn't sure what he was walking into. His instincts told him to be wary, to stay alert. The zombies could be anywhere, and the last thing he needed was to be ambushed when he was this close to salvation. As he reached the gate, Lucas hesitated. His hand hovered over the rusted metal as he peered through the crack. He could see the outlines of abandoned tents, some knocked over, others barely standing. The remnants of a small supply cache were scattered across the ground, a few empty crates and discarded weapons lying uselessly on the dirt. It was a ghost town. Damn it, Lucas muttered under his breath, his heart sinking. There was no sign of anyone alive or dead. No survivors. No military presence. The outpost, like everything else, had been swallowed by the apocalypse. But he had to go inside. There might still be something useful, something he could use to stay alive a little longer. His survival depended on it. With a deep breath, Lucas pushed the gate open, the rusted metal groaning in protest. The air inside the compound felt stale, thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. He stepped inside, the crunch of broken glass beneath his boots the only sound breaking the silence. The first few steps were slow, cautious, as if the very ground itself might betray him.
But there was no immediate threat. The camp, or what was left of it, seemed abandoned, a tragic reminder of what had once been.
He moved past a row of empty tents, the fabric torn and fluttering in the breeze like tattered flags of a forgotten war. He scanned the area, his eyes darting from one shadow to the next. He spotted a few crates off to his left, still intact. He approached them, his breath quickening with hope. Maybe they held something useful, something that would help him survive. But as he got closer, his optimism faltered. The crates were empty, their contents long gone, scavenged by others desperate enough to take whatever they could. Frustration bubbled inside Lucas, but he forced himself to remain calm. Panicking wouldn't help. He needed to keep moving, keep searching. There had to be something here that could help him, he couldn't afford to give up now. His eyes caught something on the far side of the compound. A small storage shed, tucked behind a broken-down vehicle. It looked as though it had been left untouched, the door slightly ajar. With renewed determination, Lucas made his way over, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to be careful, this could be a trap. He didn't know who, or what, might be lurking nearby. He reached the shed and peered inside. The air smelled musty, like stale wood and metal. The shelves inside were cluttered with old equipment, some of it rusted beyond recognition, but a few things stood out. A half-empty first aid kit sat on the top shelf, and a large water barrel, still half full, was tucked away in the corner. Relief flooded through Lucas as he moved toward the water barrel. He crouched down, taking the lid off the barrel and lifting the dipper inside. The water was still clear, and though it smelled faintly of rust, it was better than nothing. He drank greedily, savoring every drop. It wasn't much, but it was something that would keep him going for a little while longer. As he finished drinking, Lucas felt a twinge of hope rising within him. The outpost hadn't been a complete loss. He had food, water, and now, some basic medical supplies. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for tonight, he had what he needed. The bag on his back felt a little lighter, a little less burdensome. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to relax, just for a moment. But even as relief washed over him, the nagging feeling of unease remained. There were no other survivors here. No one to watch his back. No one to warn him when danger was near. The loneliness, the isolation, settled deep in his bones. And the silence? The silence was the loudest of all. End of Part 5. As night fully enveloped the compound, the world around Lucas became eerily still. The last remnants of daylight had vanished, leaving only the faint glow of the moon to illuminate the desolation. It was in this deep silence, as he settled in the corner of the shed, that the weight of his solitude really began to sink in. He sat against the wall, legs stretched out before him, the makeshift sleeping bag he'd found in one of the tents spread beneath him. The sounds of the undead had grown faint, but Lucas knew that didn't mean they were gone. They could be anywhere, hidden in the shadows, lurking in the dark. His thoughts kept drifting to his bag. Everything he needed to survive was inside it, his lifeline. But there was more to survival than just food, water, and medical supplies. Trust, allies, those things were as critical as anything. But trust was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. He took a deep breath, trying to shake the paranoia that seemed to creep in with the silence. It was hard to tell how long it had been since the outbreak. The world was so different now. The nights were longer, the days uncertain, and each step forward felt like a gamble. He reached over to his bag, opening it and pulling out the few remaining supplies he had, a flashlight, the half-empty first aid kit, and a few cans of beans. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going for a while longer. Just as he was about to close the bag, a faint sound pierced the stillness. It was almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down his spine. A soft scrape. The unmistakable sound of something moving, shuffling. His heart skipped a beat. He froze, straining his ears. There it was again. Shuffling. He quickly grabbed the flashlight, flicking it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. He held his breath, listening. The sound was closer now, but there was no way to tell exactly where it was coming from. Was it just a stray zombie? Or was someone or something moving in the shadows? With his hand still clutching the flashlight, Lucas moved silently toward the door of the shed. He pressed his back against the wooden frame, trying to get a better sense of what was happening outside. The beam of light danced across the compound, briefly illuminating the broken-down vehicles, abandoned tents, and empty crates. Everything seemed still, too still. The shuffling sound grew louder, then stopped. What the hell? Lucas felt a surge of unease. His instincts screamed at him to move, to leave, but his feet remained rooted to the spot. He couldn't run without knowing what was out there. Not yet. He had to be smart. Carefully, he peeked out from behind the door. The flashlight trembled slightly in his grip. His eyes scanned the surroundings, every corner of the compound bathed in pale moonlight. And then he saw it. At the far side of the compound, just beyond the cluster of wrecked vehicles, a figure stood motionless in the shadows. A faint outline against the night, it was impossible to make out its features, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was human, at least, it seemed to be. And it wasn't moving. Not yet. Lucas's mind raced. Who or what was that? A survivor? Or something else? His breath caught in his throat, and he silently cursed himself. His body was stiff, every muscle aching from tension. He wanted to make a move, but the uncertainty was paralyzing. If it was a zombie, he could handle that. But if it was someone else? Someone who didn't want him there? Suddenly, the figure took a slow step forward. Damn it! Lucas had to act fast. Without thinking, he yanked open the shed door, the hinges protesting with a loud squeal. He darted out into the open, taking a wide circle to avoid being seen. His footsteps were muffled by the dirt and debris, but he knew he wasn't entirely hidden. The flashlight still illuminated the compound in a faint, steady glow. For a moment, there was only the sound of his own breathing, ragged and uneven. He pushed forward, trying to make his way to a patch of shadow behind a pile of old supplies. There, he crouched low, watching the figure from a distance. The moonlight caught the edge of its form, revealing a few details that made Lucas's pulse spike. The figure's clothes were torn, a faded military jacket hanging loosely from its shoulders. It looked like a soldier, maybe a survivor, maybe not. But there was something about the way it stood, frozen and still, as though it was waiting for something or someone. It wasn't acting like a zombie. Zombies didn't wait. They hunted. Lucas's grip tightened around the flashlight, his mind racing. Should he confront the figure? Should he call out to see if it was a fellow survivor? But what if it wasn't? What if it was some kind of trap? The tension in the air was thick, like a cloud of uncertainty. Lucas glanced over his shoulder at the bag he'd left behind in the shed, its contents the only thing keeping him alive. Keep calm. Think. Plan. The sound of the figure shuffling toward the center of the compound made him jump. The moonlight revealed more of its form as it moved. Its gait was slower than that of a normal person, too slow, too deliberate. It wasn't human. A cold dread filled Lucas's chest as the truth hit him. It wasn't a survivor. It was a zombie. But why wasn't it attacking? It wasn't acting like the others. His thoughts spiraled, his instincts screaming at him to run, but something held him back. Something wasn't right. And in this world, the strangest things could be the deadliest. End of part 6. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly as Lucas crouched in the shadows, his eyes fixed on the figure that was now shuffling slowly across the compound. It wasn't moving with the same frenzied aggression as the typical zombies he'd encountered. No, this one was different, it was controlled, almost methodical in its movements. And that made it all the more dangerous. Lucas's heart thudded in his chest, the rapid beat almost drowning out the faint groans of other zombies in the distance. He needed to move, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from the creature. It was wearing tattered military gear, too uniform for a random survivor. And there was something else, something wrong with the way it moved. It wasn't just a zombie, it was something more. Was it a skinwalker? A person turned into something else? His mind raced as he remembered stories he'd heard from other survivors.
Tales of mutated creatures, part human, part zombie, that could think, adapt, and hunt in ways the regular undead couldn't.
The thought chilled him to the bone.
Could this be one of those?
He swallowed hard, pushing the rising panic down. His bag. His survival depended on that bag, but it was still sitting on the other side of the compound, near the shed. If the creature noticed him, there'd be no escaping.
He had no choice. He had to move.
Slowly, cautiously, Lucas rose to his feet, keeping low and out of sight. He could still hear the shuffling of the creature's feet on the ground, the occasional groan escaping its lips. It was coming closer, moving toward the center of the compound as if it were patrolling.
Focus, Lucas. Keep it together.
He kept his steps light, his breath shallow, careful not to make a sound as he moved. He knew the layout of the compound from when he'd arrived earlier. The wrecked vehicles, the scattered tents, he just needed to get around the back, out of the creature's line of sight. He needed to make it back to the shed without being noticed. The compound was larger than it had appeared from the outside, but Lucas had already mapped out a path in his mind.
He could make it. He had to make it.
The cold night air bit at his skin as he moved behind a rusted jeep, using it for cover. His eyes never left the creature. It was now standing still in the middle of the compound, head cocked slightly to one side, as if it were listening.
Lucas's heart skipped a beat. Did it know he was there? Had it heard him?
For what felt like an eternity, the creature remained motionless, its eyes locked in the direction of the shed, where Lucas had come from. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as a sense of impending danger filled the air. His entire body screamed at him to run, to leave the compound altogether, but something kept him rooted to the spot. The creature started moving again, this time toward the perimeter, its steps slow but deliberate. It didn't seem to be hunting in the way normal zombies did. It was aware of the world around it. And that made it a much more dangerous opponent. Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow aware of him, that it was waiting for him to make a move. It was toying with him. And that knowledge made the air feel thick, suffocating. If he stayed here much longer, his chances of escaping would diminish.
Time was running out.
He glanced toward the shed.
The bag. He needed it. Now. Move now.
Lucas dashed from behind the jeep, making a beeline for the shed. His footsteps were nearly soundless against the dirt, but his every movement felt amplified in the quiet night. He reached the door to the shed, hands trembling as he grabbed the handle. It was locked. His heart pounded in his chest, the urgency of the moment making his mind spiral. There was no time to waste. With one swift motion, he kicked the door, sending it crashing open. Inside, everything seemed as it had been before, empty, abandoned. His bag was still where he'd left it. He reached for it, pulling it onto his back, his fingers brushing the edge of the flashlight he'd tossed inside earlier. Without a second thought, he grabbed it, flicking the switch to turn the beam on, just in time to see the creature's figure emerge from the shadows. It was closer now, far closer than it had been when he'd first seen it. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing its face, or rather, what was left of it. The skin around its eyes had been stretched tight, as though it had been pulled too far, too painfully. Its lips were cracked and dry, and there was no trace of humanity left in its gaze. But what struck Lucas the most was its eyes. They were watching him. They weren't the mindless, dead eyes of a typical zombie. No, these eyes were calculating, sharp, and full of malice. Lucas's breath hitched in his throat as the creature took another slow, deliberate step toward him.
It knows what I am. He didn't wait for it to take the next step.
He turned, sprinting back toward the far side of the compound, heading for the cover of an abandoned van. The creature was fast now, its movements a blur as it followed him. The bag weighed heavily on his back, but Lucas's focus remained solely on his escape. There was no room for hesitation. If he faltered for even a moment, it would be over. He could hear the creature's footsteps pounding behind him, and the growl that escaped its throat sent a chill through his body.
It was gaining on him. It wasn't just following him, it was hunting him.
He rounded the corner of the van, pressing his back against the cold metal as he gasped for air. The flashlight in his hand illuminated his surroundings in sharp, quick bursts, his heart beat loud in his ears.
It wasn't over. Not yet. End of part 7.
Lucas pressed his back against the side of the van, the cold metal sending a shiver through his body as he steadied his breath. He could feel his pulse racing, the weight of the bag on his back now a constant reminder of the stakes. The creature was closing in fast. It had tracked him effortlessly, its shuffling steps growing louder, its breath raspy and uneven. He knew it wouldn't stop until it had him. The flashlight in his hand flickered as he gripped it tighter, the beam flashing erratically in the dim moonlight. He needed a plan. There was no way he was going to outrun it, not with the way it was moving, too fast, too calculated. It was learning. It was adapting. I can't let it get any closer. His eyes scanned the area, searching for anything that could help him. The compound was quiet, the sound of distant groans from other zombies a hollow reminder of the chaos that had overtaken the world. But here, in this moment, there was no time to worry about the rest of the undead horde. It was just him and the creature now. A sudden, low growl from behind him broke his concentration. His heart lurched. It was right there. Without thinking, Lucas dove to the side, rolling across the ground, his body hitting the dirt with a thud. He barely managed to push himself to his feet in time to see the creature lunge forward, its clawed hands reaching for him with terrifying speed. He didn't hesitate. Using all his strength, Lucas sprinted toward the far side of the compound, heading toward the small storage shed he had previously used as a refuge. The creature was right behind him, its growls becoming more guttural with every step. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed his legs to move faster. The flashlight bounced wildly in his hand, illuminating the path ahead, but it was his instincts that guided him now. He reached the shed in seconds, slamming into the door and yanking it open. His eyes scanned the interior. The space was small, cramped, but there had to be something, anything, to use as a weapon. His gaze fell on an old crowbar lying in the corner. The rusted metal gleamed faintly in the flashlight's beam. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He grabbed the crowbar and turned just in time to see the creature charging toward him. There was no time for hesitation. No time for fear. He raised the crowbar high, gripping it tightly, his knuckles white from the pressure. The creature reached out with its twisted arms, but Lucas swung the crowbar with everything he had. The impact sent a shockwave through his arm, but it was enough to knock the creature off balance, its grotesque body stumbling back a few steps. The creature hissed in anger, its eyes locking onto Lucas with renewed intensity. It didn't stop. It lunged again. But Lucas was ready this time. He swung the crowbar again, this time aiming for the creature's head. The blow landed with a sickening crunch, but it wasn't enough to stop it. The creature let out a screech, stumbling backward but regaining its footing faster than Lucas anticipated. This isn't working. In that moment, Lucas knew he needed to do something drastic. The creature was relentless. His only chance was to use the environment to his advantage. He glanced around the shed, and his eyes landed on a stack of crates near the back wall. If he could create some sort of barricade or distraction, he might be able to trap it long enough to make his escape. But he had to act fast. He pushed forward, dodging another swipe from the creature's claws. His pulse thundered in his ears as he moved to the crates, throwing them aside with all his strength. The creature was right behind him, its growls deafening now, but Lucas managed to push one last crate into position right in the path of the door. It wasn't much, but it would slow the creature down, at least for a moment. With everything he had, Lucas ran for the back of the shed. He grabbed a large piece of metal scrap from the ground and hurled it toward the opposite side, hoping to create a diversion. The sound of metal crashing against the wall echoed in the small space, and for a split second, the creature hesitated. That hesitation was enough. Lucas sprinted toward the back door of the shed, kicking it open with his foot. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. His legs burned as he ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He headed toward the compound's edge, the area where the perimeter fence had been partially torn down by the earlier chaos. The weak spot. His escape route. He reached the gap in the fence and squeezed through, his body scraping against the sharp edges of broken metal. But he didn't stop. Not until he was outside the compound, surrounded by the thick trees that had once seemed so intimidating, but now offered the only chance at survival. He collapsed against a tree, gasping for air, the adrenaline slowly draining from his body. He felt the weight of the bag on his back once more, the reminder of everything he had fought for. He was alive. For now. But the creature, whatever it was still out there. He knew that. The world had changed, and survival was no longer just about escaping the zombies. It was about surviving the unknown. And Lucas had learned the hard way that there were far worse things lurking in the shadows than the mindless undead. His story wasn't over. It had only just begun. End of Part 8.